So, good morning, everyone. I want to take a closer look this morning at this elusive concept of no self that's one of the more inaccessible notions I think that the Buddha taught. But I want to look at it from a relational perspective and sort of how complicated that gets. Because as we know from prior talks and on this subject, the self is not fixed. Yes, we have a self. It's not that we have no self. We have a self. We need a self to function, but it is always in flux. It is not fixed. It's constantly changing feelings, emotions, physical response, and so forth. But all that said, it still wants to be in relationship. I mean, we are social creatures. We are social relational creatures who seek connection with others. It's just simply part of our evolutionary history as a species. But this self can get easily disrupted. Let's say when we feel this sense of righteous indignation, when we're hurt, we may want to isolate ourselves or become defensive or rigid or self-important or judgmental. All of that is the ego part of the self being reactive. It's trying to protect itself, defend itself, and so forth. And if we really get into this notion of the self, it's very profound because, as I said, it's not a fixed permanent entity. It's fluid, ever-changing. But think about the nuances of this. So if my mood suddenly shifts, that self is always moving and shifting, I'm going to react very differently to you relationally than I did 5 minutes ago. Or if, all of a sudden my toe hurts, there's always change going on with all of us, which makes relating more challenging, more complicated, especially if we're not mindful of these changes. If we're just on autopilot, it's just the luck of the draw whether at any moment where my changes are they compatible with what's going on inside of you. So it begins to, as we dig into it, we begin to see how nuanced this whole relational thing can be given the constant influx nature of the self. Think of the self as, here's again another one of my favorite water metaphors. It's like a river that is constant, the self is, but it's never made up of the same water twice. We are never the same in all aspects, moment to moment. And that can seem pretty daunting, but it really invites us to see this more closely as an interplay of thoughts, feelings, emotions, sensations, and it's what is often called emptiness. We talked about this term of emptiness a couple months ago. But even though, as I said, it's not fixed, it is deeply relational. It's arising often in response to, in connection to others and to the world around us. It wants to be in relation to others. We all seek and crave connection and relationship. But our response when we feel triggered or hurt or whatever becomes a key tension in our human experience. It highlights how our relational nature can lead to both connection on the one hand, but lots of conflict on the other. How our reactions to emotional pain or perceived harm can trap us back into suffering. We ruminate about it, we lick our wounds, we dwell on it. Don't they understand? How can they not see this about me? And so on. But this knowledge, then the insight into this knowledge offers us a profound opportunity for deep practice. Because remember, the other thing that the Buddha taught, or one of the other things about the self, is that we're interdependent. We're all connected. This concept of dependent origination, that nothing exists independently, everything is interconnected. So the self, even though it's not an autonomous separate entity, does arise in relation to others. This constant state of flux of the self is influenced not only by our past causes and conditions, our past history, but our current interactions with each other. You are constantly influencing me, I'm constantly influencing you. How my words land this morning might influence each of you differently. You might hear them or experience them differently, depending on your own ever-changing sense of self. The interconnectedness is why relationship and connection is so important. Because our sense of self is often defined in terms of how we relate to each other. Whether that's a parent, a friend, a partner, a colleague, a casual acquaintance. But this is the thing that, as much as it's important, also makes us vulnerable. On the one hand, when relationships bring joy, happiness, and love, we feel uplifted. But when they bring conflict and misunderstanding and pain, we experience suffering. Okay? And the feeling of getting hurt by another person arises from this complicated interplay. It is our response of being hurt is a natural reaction to pain, but clinging to that reaction, especially in the form of righteous indignation or holding on to a grudge or just, licking our wounds forever, reinforces the illusion of a fixed separate self. And it can quickly lead us into a state of isolation, rigid isolation. Okay? This righteous indignation, and we've all been there, arises when we feel wronged or victimized. We have all experienced it. We will experience it again in the future. And while it may seem justified in the moment, we have to watch it mindfully because it is about the ego, and it feeds a sense of self-importance. It feeds a sense of self-righteousness, and most importantly and most painfully, a sense of separateness. When we are hurt, we immediately create a story we tell ourselves about it. And what that story does, it tends to have us solidify this distinct sense of a separate me that has been wronged by an other who is to blame for my suffering, which creates a rigid boundary between me and you. This mental story, this narrative. And it gets in the way of connection, of understanding, of resolution, of reconciliation. And again, it's all rooted in our good old friend, the ego. If I'm feeling righteous indignation and I bring mindfulness to it, it's a red flag that I am at that moment indulging my ego. I'm not trying to see things, more spaciously about, well, maybe you didn't intend it, or that was a miscue because of these constant two states of flux. Can we talk about it? Okay. Because if not, I'm clinging to a false sense of a fixed self with an ego that is trying to protect itself. But remember, the ego thrives on separation. Me, me, me. But all it does is magnify my pain, amplifies my sense of being right, and fuels judgment toward the other person who I feel wronged me. And it allows me to justify my anger. It doesn't help me set it aside and see things more clearly, because that moment I'm trapped in my suffering. And remember, the Buddha taught that anger is like clinging to a hot coal with the intention of hoping that the other person gets burned. Now, the good news is that the way out of this cycle of suffering actually runs through the ego, because when we feel the sting of hurt and the pull of righteous indignation, our practice, our mindfulness asks us to pause and observe without judgment what is arising. This is the whole notion of insight meditation. Insight into what is arising. If I'm on autopilot, I'm just going to keep doing the same thing, and I'm going to suffer and you're going to suffer. But with insight and awareness, I see that my thoughts and emotions as they arise, and I recognize them for the ego nature of them as they are. And I see that this whole situation is impermanent, ever-changing, consists of stories and not fixed truths. When we observe our hurt feelings without judgment, we can begin to deconstruct the narrative that fuels our suffering. We ask ourselves, who is this me that feels hurt? Who is this self-important, ego-driven me that's just gotten his feelings hurt? Who is this permanent, unchanging self that I'm clinging to? Or is it a momentary experience, a passing experience, an impermanent experience arising in response to causes and conditions? Alternately, who is this other that I blame? Is that person also not a complex, ever-changing being shaped by their own struggles, their own causes and conditions? This inquiry is so important because it softens the rigid boundaries between self and other. It helps us see our interconnection. It helps us see that both we and the person who hurt us are caught in this web of interdependence that is shaped by all the history, all the causes, all the conditions of our lives. And this insight helps give rise to compassion, not only for ourselves, but for the other person. It is a tremendous tool to lessen conflict, to foster reconciliation. Now, I'm not talking here, and I need to say this often, about condoning harm or denying our pain. I'm not talking about excusing someone who's harmed us. But I'm saying, even if we feel in the moment we can't forgive them, but it means recognizing the shared humanity in all of us and trying when we can to respond with kindness and wisdom. The relational nature of ourselves, this ever-changing self, is not something to avoid or escape, but to embrace with wisdom and skill. The Buddha taught that the practice of loving kindness, of metta, the practice of forgiveness are practical tools for navigating relationships with greater ease and understanding. I know of no practice other than loving kindness which helps foster this understanding, helps foster this sense of connection. Wishing people well, wishing even difficult people well, helps extend goodwill to ourselves and others, and dissolves the walls of separation that righteous indignation and our egos are constantly building. When we practice forgiveness, we set down the heavy burden of resentment. You know, righteous indignation loves resentment, but it causes us suffering. And when we set it down, we open the door to healing and greater connection. And again, it doesn't mean we ignore harm or allow others to mistreat us, because Buddhism also recognized the importance of setting healthy boundaries and addressing injustice. You know, he says, guard ourselves like we would guard a frontier village. Frontier village. You know, this encourages us to do it from a place of clarity, from clear seeing, and from compassion, rather than ego and rather than the reactivity that originates in the ego. Because when we respond to conflict with clarity and not ego, we honor our relational nature. We affirm our relational nature. We are a relational creatures, and the Buddha calls upon us to cultivate that, to free ourselves from the clinging and the aversion that comes from separation. So the takeaway for today is that the self, though not fixed, though forever changing, is deeply relational. And we need to bring the tools of our practice to see that. And to see that our human desire for connection reflects this truth of interdependence. And our reactions to pain and harm reveal the ways we cling to this false sense of separation. The feeling of being hurt, accompanied by righteous indignation, is of course a natural response, but it's an unskillful response that isolates us from each other and fuels our suffering. But with our practice, we transform this reaction into an opportunity for growth and healing. We notice what's arising, we pause, and then we bring wisdom and discernment to these interactions. Because in embracing the relational nature of the self, we get closer to the heart of what the Buddha taught. We understand that we're not separate from each other. And this is intertwined with the liberation of all beings. By letting go of rigid self-importance and judgment, we open ourselves up to the possibility of true connection that is grounded in our shared humanity. And in this way, we navigate the challenges of relationship with this crazy self with grace, and we transform suffering into the path of awakening and more satisfying relationships. So that's some thoughts this morning on the self as relational.